So, good morning, and may I say also a happy Mother's Day to all the mothers amongst us. I know that potentially this reading came as a little bit of surprise to you because we've been busy in a series in Genesis. And the fact is that that series, when we began it, was only intended to go so far as the lives of the patriarchs, that is to go through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and end with the story of Jacob in Genesis 35. But we drifted a little bit beyond this into the stories and the lives of first Judah, and then Karen last week took us through a little bit about the story of Joseph. But that's just a sort of taste. Today we're starting a new series. I'll say as well that the PowerPoint's also an experiment because we're actually using Google Sheets instead of PowerPoint, and it's been its own technical problem to try and use that. And what we're looking at today is a subject, a topic, rather than just walking through a book of the Bible. In sort of theological training terms, like if you go to Regent, a study like this is called a theological study, as opposed to when you go through a book which is called a biblical study, which makes it sound like that what we're doing is not biblical. It is biblical, but what we're doing is picking up a theme. And in our particular case, we're going to pick up, you might say, an underlying assumption in Scripture. Because essentially it's not something that's overtly stated all that clearly, and yet it pervades everything. And that is to look at the connection between the physical and the spiritual world. And really to get to understand that we do not live in two worlds, and we do not live two lives. We do not have a spiritual life and then a life that we live each day in the world. They are, in fact, one and the same thing. All of our life is our spiritual life. And so for the next 8 weeks to the end of June, we're going to consider the ways that the physical, earthly, daily reality of life integrates with our spiritual lives. Because we live our spiritual lives in our physical bodies, in our physical world. So that fundamentally, without our physical reality, we would have no spiritual reality. The passage we read puts it like this. I'm going to read verse 16 and then verse 20. For by him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. Here's a key phrase. All things were created through him and for him. And through him, verse 20, to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of the cross. And the passage makes clear that the work of Christ encompasses all things, from the time of creation and in its creation to its redemption on the work on the cross, and so on. All things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, were created by him, but also for him. And I do know that what I've just said sounds very theoretical and philosophical. So let me try and state it a different way, in a sense, using an illustration or an example. And we're going to take an example from the story of Joseph in Genesis, which illustrates how God works in ways that we have a tendency to actually forget or to misunderstand. So let's understand just the story. Joseph, Egypt, and the famine. I apologize that we cannot bring up these lines point by point, so you're getting the whole page of the PowerPoint in one go on sheets. So the story of Jacob's family focuses primarily on two people, on Joseph and Judah. And that story of Joseph and Judah and the bigger family unfolds within a larger story of what is going on in the world. Because what we see in the story is that God makes sure that Joseph is in the right place at the right time to ensure that he can interpret Pharaoh's dream and prepare the nation for the famine that is to come. And then, prior to that moment, of course, to get Joseph to Egypt, God uses his brother's jealousy to turn them against him. And just as they're actually about to kill him, God makes sure that a group of Ishmaelite traders, Genesis 37, arrive on the scene, and they say, hey, let's sell him to them instead of killing him. And so they do that. And then the Ishmaelites take him off to Egypt. They sell him to Potiphar. There's a long story around that. And he eventually ends up in prison. And out of prison, he meets, he comes through all the story with Potiphar's wife. He ends up in prison. Then he meets these two servants of Pharaoh. And they, to keep it short, in prison, Joseph accurately interprets dreams for these two servants of Pharaoh. And when Pharaoh much later has a dream, the one servant, his cupbearer, says, who no one can interpret, says, hey, I know a guy who can interpret dreams. And so Joseph interprets Pharaoh's dream and is appointed as head over the land. And through that, he ensures that provision is made for the lean years that come after 7 years of plenty, so that he ensures the survival not only of his own family, but in fact of all of Egypt and all of the Near Eastern world. And first, we have to notice that this is a very real, worldly, historical story. All of what I've just described could be written as world history, could be written from newspaper articles of the time, in a sense. But at the same time, God very clearly is also at work behind the scenes. And in particular, he blesses Joseph, gets him into the right places, sometimes through difficult circumstances, so that, but then blesses him so that he wins favor at key moments, so that he can be there when key things happen and grow in his own skills and so on. Being put first as head of Potiphar's house, and then head of the prison, and then finally head of Egypt, all the way along, learning managerial and organizational and administrative skills. And the truth is that what happened to Joseph could have happened to any one of us, assuming we lived then or he lived now. Because the truth is, we see in our world today, many successful people come from somewhat dysfunctional families, often from whom they're estranged, and they make it to the top through a mix of hard work and competence and good ideas and good fortune. And you have to understand that in the ancient world, interpreting dreams was recognized as a career path in Egypt. And people were trained to interpret dreams. And the truth is, even sometimes they did not know the answers and are not always correct. So to bring it into the present, consider that a dream interpreter, a professional dream interpreter from the ancient world, would be like for us today, a political analyst or an economist, or maybe even a weather forecaster, who's looking at signs and issues and so on, and then telling us what the future holds and why we are where we are and what's going on. And that's what they were like in the ancient world. So that we see Joseph and all the earthly characters live very real lives. And those lives that they're living are an integral part of the spiritual story that's unfolding. There's not two things going on. There's one thing going on that is both at the same time, both spiritual and physical, real in this world. So that every part of the story is also part of what God is doing in people's lives and in the world. And the fact is that God could have done things very differently. I mean, other alternatives are very possible. And I want to, for a moment, stop then and look at alternatives. For one thing, there were other ways to get Joseph to Egypt to interpret Pharaoh's dreams. He did not have to be sold as a slave, end up in prison, interpret dreams, and so on. He could have, for example, God could have let Pharaoh have an extra dream at the time he was dreaming that told him to send to Canaan for this man called Joseph who would interpret his dream for him. And the point is that something like that happened in the story of Cornelius and Peter in Acts chapter 10. Cornelius has a vision of an angel. It says Acts 10 verses 5 and 6. An angel speaks to Cornelius and says, "And now send men to Joppa and bring one Simon, who is called Peter. He is lodging with one Simon called a tanner, whose house is by the sea." So Cornelius has a dream being told, I'm going to let you know about salvation. And in the dream is also, and to find out about it, send to Joppa. He's living in Caesarea. So send to another city and bring Peter, who's living by the sea in the Simon the tanner's house. I mean, Pharaoh could have had a dream like that. And in that case, Joseph could have traveled to Egypt as Pharaoh's honored guest instead of as a slave of Ishmaelite traders. And there are many alternative ways that Pharaoh could have prepared for the famine. He could have overseen the preparations for himself. He could have appointed any number of officials to take responsibility for the various tasks that needed to be done. But as Karen pointed out last week, God uses the circumstances of the story to bring very real change in the lives of both Joseph and Judah, and to bring a lot of redemption and healing to Jacob's family. So that the spiritual story is embedded in the worldly story. And let's even take this one step further. I mean, why all this hassle in the first place? Why have this long, complicated story? You know, we say, well, you know, God knew that a famine was coming, so he took all these steps to make sure that Egypt would prepare for it, and so that many lives would be saved from starvation. So God had to do something, otherwise everyone would die. But God is the God of the weather. He could have just decided not to let the famine happen in the first place. And if there was no famine, the whole story would not have been necessary. And then, in fact, Genesis 37 to 47 could have been one sentence long. God made sure there was no famine and everyone lived happily ever after. If we think about the present, right now we have a pandemic raging in our world. And theologically, it's been a miracle how quickly we developed a vaccine. And I unfortunately got my first shot last Monday. So I'm in the system already. And God did bless us as a world, in a sense, with where we are in terms of scientific and medical knowledge, and the people we had who all worked together to make the breakthroughs we needed at such speed. And now nations and organizations are having to work together to get the rollout of vaccines to go on as fast as possible. But at the same time that's all happening, each one of us is facing all kinds of spiritual and physical or worldly challenges as a result of the pandemic. In the sense that the disruption of the pandemic is the context in which we are living our spiritual lives. It has brought into our lives special challenges and sorrows. It's brought for some opportunities. It's changed the way we interact with each other and fiddled with our lives. It's disrupted relationships and changed how we work, and it's brought hardships. And in the midst of all of this, we are being formed and molded. And our walk with God is being tested and renewed and developed. So what I'm saying is that the pandemic is not a distraction from life. It is our life. Just as having children is not a distraction from our spiritual lives. They are our spiritual, they are the context in which our lives work out. the jobs we have and the issues that go on with our houses and our cars and all the things that we have to get done. It's all part of one life, which is at the same time both physical and spiritual. And to understand this, we need to understand a very key aspect of the work of God, what I will call complementarity. Let's come back to the story of Joseph, because I've already given you the brief summary of the world circumstances that were going on. We know Joseph gets to Egypt through the duplicity of his brothers, and by Potiphar in prison, he ends up before Pharaoh and he saves the land. But when he reveals himself to his brothers after they've come to get grain, Joseph tells the story a very different way. Genesis 45, verses 4 to 8. He's now just revealed to his brothers who he is. So Joseph said to his brothers, "Come near to me." And they came near, and he said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me to preserve your life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are yet 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. And God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh and lord of all his house and ruler over the land of Egypt." Listen to verse 8 of Genesis 45 again. "It was not you who sent me here, but God." So who sent Joseph to Egypt? God or his brothers? The answer is both. And this is complementarity. There are two equally true and valid and complementary explanations for what happened to Joseph. On the one hand, what happened to him is fully explainable in worldly, earthly terms without any reference to God. Because of jealousy, his brother sold him into slavery. That was a visible worldly thing that happened. Through hard work and good fortune and knowing the right people, sometimes in difficult circumstances, he ended up rising to the top. And to a large degree, to put it in modern terms, he played the futures market on grain and made a killing. And if he lived today, we would have a way to describe his story in these kinds of terms, of how he lived and then he struggled and he had problems with his family and he was estranged from them, and then he worked hard and through all kinds of hardships and everything, he managed to rise up and eventually traded a massive futures market on grain and made a killing. And now he's George Bezos or Elon Musk or whoever we want to say. But exactly at the same time, in a sense, on a different plane of information, in a different paradigm, God was at work in all of these circumstances to achieve his purpose. Let's talk about living it. What I'm raising here is in fact an issue that challenges us in our time as Christian people at a very deep level. We tend to be actually quite Gnostic in our mentality about our spirituality. Now, I know that may not mean a lot to you, but Gnosticism was a very serious heresy that threatened the early church, which tried to hyper-spiritualize everything and really made out like the physical world was just a disruption and an interference with our spirituality. And what I'm saying is we sometimes make our spiritual lives all about our internal frame of mind and something that's going on in our hearts, and nothing matters as long as our hearts are in the right place with God. But actually, that's not true, because the physical is sometimes the spiritual. And there is a spiritual dimension woven into everything that happens to us. And when I say that sometimes the physical is the spiritual, think about this. Without water, a physical thing called water, there would be no baptism. Without the physical elements of bread and wine, there would be no Eucharist, no communion. And at an even bigger level, without other people around us, we would be unable to love others as Christ loved us. So what I'm saying is, the physical world is the thing that allows us to function spiritually. And part of understanding is to realize that Jesus' work reaches the whole creation. Colossians 1:16, all things were created through him and for him. And Jesus reconciled to himself all things, whether in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible. He did not just save us. He saved the entire cosmos in his work. And all of this is because us and our world and the cosmos were all created not just through him, but for him. The world is not something separate from our spiritual reality. We live, in fact, in one sacred world. Everything that is going on in your life is part of your spiritual walk. Paul wrote this to the Corinthians, 1 Corinthians 10, verse 31. So whether you eat or drink, or whatever you do all to the glory of God. We're going to talk more about baptism, about the communion. We're also going to talk about how do we do things to the glory of God. How do I eat to the glory of God? How do I drink to the glory of God? How do I do my job to the glory of God? How do I be a parent to the glory of God? And we're going to be exploring those through this series. But I want you this week to really take some time to look at the ordinary events of your daily life and consider how they integrate into your walk with God. What I'm saying is, try to identify the complementarity. You've got a very physical, real-world explanation of what's going on in your life. And that's true in Joseph's story. But right at the same time as all of that is true, it was also true that God was doing big things. And so I'm saying, look at your life and consider how God may be behind and in what you are doing and what you are facing. And we will talk about how we can learn to see it. Let us pray together.